What if I told you hundreds of thousands of people in America were just one decision away from being forced out overnight? And then suddenly, the Supreme Court stepped in and stopped everything. But here's the twist. This isn't just about immigration anymore. This is about power. Because while Donald Trump is trying to push one of the most aggressive immigration crackdowns in modern history, the courts, the government, and even America's institutions are starting to push back. So the real question is this the moment Trump loses control, or the moment he doubles down? This was supposed to be another victory lap for Donald Trump. Another day in which the machinery of his second term moved forward at full speed. Another headline proving that his administration was not just talking about remaking America, but doing it in real time. The immigration crackdown was advancing. Deportation powers were expanding. Loyalists were reshaping cultural institutions. And Trump himself was once again treating the White House like the command center of a personal political revolution. But then, in the middle of that momentum, the Supreme Court stepped in and did something that instantly changed the mood in Washington. It did not slam the brakes completely. It did not rule against him outright. But it refused to give him what he wanted right now. And in Trump-era politics, even a delay can feel like a warning shot. At the center of the storm was Temporary Protected Status, or TPS, a program that sounds bureaucratic until you understand what it actually means for the people involved. For hundreds of thousands of migrants already living in the United States, TPS is the thin legal shield that allows them to work, stay, and avoid deportation back to countries engulfed by disaster, war, or collapse. For Haitians, that protection traces back to the catastrophic 2010 earthquake and the chaos that followed. For Syrians, it came from the brutal civil war that shattered the country and turned it into one of the defining humanitarian disasters of the modern era. Now the Trump administration wants that shield gone. The numbers alone tell you why this matters. Around 350,000 Haitians, more than 6,000 Syrians. Not abstract figures. Families, workers, parents, nurses, drivers, students, business owners, people who built lives in America while the places they came from spiraled into violence and instability. Trump's team wants to terminate those protections as part of a broader immigration crackdown, a campaign built not just on border enforcement, but on dismantling the legal mechanisms that allowed hundreds of thousands to remain in the country in the first place. And for a while, it looked like the administration might get its way fast. Lower courts had pushed back. Migrants sued. Judges blocked the move. Administration lawyers raced to the Supreme Court and asked for emergency intervention. They wanted the justices to step in immediately, override the lower courts, and allow the protections to end while the legal fight continued. That has become a defining pattern of Trump's presidency. Push the boundary, get sued, then ask the Supreme Court to act quickly and decisively. And sometimes, the justices have done exactly that. They previously allowed Trump to lift protections for more than 300,000 Venezuelans under TPS, even while the legal battle was still underway. That gave the administration reason to believe this case might break its way too. But Monday did not go according to script. Instead of giving Trump an instant green light, the Supreme Court said it would hear oral arguments next month. No immediate victory. No sudden deportation wave. No overnight termination of status for hundreds of thousands of people. The justices deferred a decision and moved the case onto a fast track, meaning the issue will now be argued openly and decided later, likely in June or early July. On paper, that sounds procedural. In political terms, it was seismic. Because it means Trump's immigration offensive has run into something he hates almost as much as defeat: delay. That is what made this day feel so revealing, because the Supreme Court decision came against the backdrop of a much bigger picture. one in which multiple fronts of Trump's agenda were colliding at once. At the same moment his administration was fighting to strip legal protections from migrants, another appeals court was allowing his controversial third country deportation policy to continue for now. Elsewhere, the Kennedy Center board had voted to close the institution for 2 years under Trump's renovation plan. His chief of staff, Susie Wiles, revealed that she had early-stage breast cancer, but would remain in her position. And even airport security staffing was beginning to fray under the pressure of a partial government shutdown tied to Homeland Security funding. This is what makes the Trump story so difficult to look away from. Nothing happens in isolation. One courtroom battle bleeds into another. One institutional fight opens a second, then a third. One day starts with immigration law and ends with the future of American culture, national security staffing, and a president publicly discussing private medical issues of an ally in Congress. It is not just government. It is a rolling political spectacle in which everything feels connected because Trump makes everything about power, loyalty, and motion. And that is exactly why the TPS case matters so much beyond the migrants themselves. It is a test not only of immigration law, but of how far this administration can go, how fast the courts will let it move, and whether Trump's second term will be defined by unstoppable acceleration or by a series of institutional collisions. The administration says the lower courts are blocking major executive branch initiatives and harming the national interest. Migrants and their lawyers say the decisions to terminate TPS were preordained, careless, and in some cases driven by animus rather than fact-based assessments of country conditions. Between those positions sits a Supreme Court that has already been accused of moving too aggressively for Trump through unexplained emergency orders. This time the justices chose a different path, not an answer, not yet, but a pause. And in Trump's America, a pause is never just a pause. It is a countdown. Because now everyone knows what comes next. Oral arguments, a national spotlight, a ruling that could reshape the legal status of entire communities by summer. Trump will frame it as a battle over sovereignty, control, and the right of a president to set immigration policy. His critics will frame it as a battle over humanity, due process, and the danger of sending people back into collapsing nations. The court will be asked to define the limits of executive power in one of the most politically explosive areas of American life. So the question is no longer whether this fight will happen. It is how big it becomes. Because what started as an administrative move to end protections for Haitians and Syrians is now turning into a much larger confrontation over immigration, over the court, and over the meaning of presidential power in Trump's second term. And that was only the beginning. To understand why this legal fight exploded into one of the biggest stories in Washington, you have to understand what the Trump administration is really trying to build. This is not just about one program, or one ruling, or even one set of migrants. It is about constructing an immigration system defined by uncertainty, speed, and fear. A system in which protections can vanish quickly, legal categories can be reinterpreted aggressively, and deportation itself becomes not just a policy tool, but a political message. The message is simple. Nobody should feel secure unless the administration says so. That is why the TPS battle over Haitians and Syrians is only one piece of a much larger machine. Elsewhere on the same day, an appeals court allowed the administration's third country deportation policy to continue, at least for now. That may sound technical, but its implications are brutal. The policy allows immigrants to be deported not just to their home countries, but to other countries willing to take them, sometimes dangerous, unfamiliar countries, and sometimes on very short notice. It is one of the administration's boldest attempts to disrupt the expectations that migrants and their lawyers have long relied upon. The old assumption was that, if deported, a person would be sent home. The new approach says home may not matter at all. The human stakes are enormous. Critics argue the policy collides head-on with the principle of non-refoulement, the idea woven into American immigration law and international protections that governments should not send people to places where they risk persecution or torture. Trump's defenders respond that the administration is simply removing people to countries willing to receive them, and that activist judges have repeatedly interfered with lawful executive authority. That is the line the Department of Homeland Security has embraced. This is not cruelty, they say, but enforcement, not chaos, but control. For the Haitians challenging Trump, the argument is especially charged. Their lawyers say the administration failed to genuinely assess conditions on the ground and instead pursued a predetermined outcome. According to the article, is in the middle of the war with Iran. Yet the administration insists the conditions no longer justify protection. That disconnect is exactly what makes the case so combustible. The legal issue may be administrative. The factual reality is war, collapse, and survival. The Supreme Court's decision to hear argument, rather than immediately side with Trump, suggests something unusual may be happening. Over the past year, the justices have been criticized for using thin emergency orders to make sweeping decisions without full reasoning. Former judges from both parties even filed in support of the migrants, warning that unexplained emergency rulings are not especially informative and should not become shortcuts for deciding major disputes. That criticism may have landed, because this time the court did not simply do what it had done before. It slowed down. That does not mean Trump will lose, but it means the court may want more than emergency rhetoric before signing off on something this consequential. And while all of this was unfolding, another Trump battle was erupting in a very different arena, the Kennedy Center. If immigration is where Trump projects toughness, the arts are where he projects dominance. During his first term, he kept the cultural institution at arm's length. In the second, he has turned it into an obsession. He gutted the board, filled it with allies, added his own name to the facade, pushed out leadership, and now has championed a plan to shut the institution for 2 years for renovations. Trump framed it in the language he loves most: construction, control, transformation. What I know best in the world is construction, he said. The center, in his telling, had been let go to hell, and now he would rebuild it. His critics are not convinced. Democrats argue the closure may be tied as much to financial damage, artist cancellations, and political controversy as to structural necessity. Representative Joyce Beatty is challenging the closure in court and warned the board against moving forward without Congress. Artists have canceled. Supporters have fled. Layoffs loom. Trump says he has removed DEI and restored patriotic, family-friendly programming. His allies say the institution was overdue for a reset. His critics say he is waging ideological war under cover of renovation. Why does that matter in a script about immigration and the Supreme Court? Because it reveals the pattern. On immigration, Trump argues old protections are illegitimate and must be stripped away. At the Kennedy Center, old leadership and cultural norms are treated the same way. In both cases, institutions are not merely adjusted, they are captured, purged, and remade. The language changes, the logic does not. Trump's second term is being built around the same instinct on every front. If an institution does not serve his agenda, it must be brought to heel. That is what made March 16 feel like such an important day. It was not just about a court order. It was a snapshot of the entire presidency in motion. A government trying to deport people faster and farther. A White House trying to reshape culture. Courts pushing back in some places and stepping aside in others. Loyalists elevated, critics sidelined, and every decision filtered through the force of one man's political will. But if the administration thought it could keep moving without friction, the next phase of the story suggests otherwise. Because the real danger for Trump is not one courtroom loss or one ugly headline. It is accumulation. A court defers here. A funding crisis hits there. A culture war deepens. A staffing problem spreads. Bit by bit, the image of total control begins to crack. And that crack was becoming visible. Trump's great political talent has always been the ability to project momentum, even when the machinery underneath him is shaking. He knows how to dominate a news cycle, how to turn legal peril into spectacle, how to frame resistance as proof of his strength rather than his weakness. But the deeper you look into this moment, the more you see something else. Strain. Not collapse. Not yet. But strain. And in politics, especially Trump-era politics, strain is where the hidden story lives. Start with the partial government shutdown. Homeland Security funding has lapsed as Democrats refuse to back the department without reforms to immigration enforcement agencies after 2 U.S. citizens were killed during mass deportation operations. That alone would have been a massive story in any normal administration. Under Trump, it competes with 10 others. Yet its consequences are already visible. More than 10% of airport security agents reportedly did not show up to work on Sunday, compared with a typical absence rate of less than 2%. Missed paychecks have consequences. Public servants can only absorb so much disruption before the system starts to wobble. That matters because Homeland Security is not just another bureaucracy in Trump's America. It is the nerve center of one of his signature political promises, mass deportation. If that department starts to buckle under shutdown pressure, then the administration's most aggressive policies begin to collide with practical reality. The same government demanding expanded deportation power is struggling to keep airport security staffed. The same White House accusing judges of undermining national interests is presiding over the kinds of institutional stress that expose how difficult governing by confrontation can become. Then there is the issue of Susie Wiles, Trump's chief of staff, who revealed she has early-stage breast cancer, but intends to remain on the job during treatment. On one level, that is a personal health announcement and should be treated with respect. On another, it is politically significant. Wiles is one of the central stabilizing figures in Trump's operation, widely seen as disciplined, strategic, and crucial to keeping the administration's power structure functioning. Her prognosis, according to her, is strong. But in a White House built on intense pressure, loyalty battles, and non-stop crisis management, even temporary strain at the top matters. It introduces uncertainty into a structure that depends heavily on a small circle of trusted operators. And then there is Trump himself, publicly discussing the private health problems of Representative Neil Dunn, saying the Florida Republican would have been dead by June without his help connecting with doctors. That kind of public disclosure is classic Trump. Personal, blunt, theatrical, and unconcerned with conventional boundaries. Supporters hear authenticity. Critics hear recklessness. Either way, it reinforces a central truth of this presidency. Privacy, decorum, and institutional restraint are always subordinate to Trump's instinct for dominance and narrative control. The same instinct was on display at the Kennedy Center, where the cultural battle has taken on an almost surreal quality. He publicly praises construction plans, while artists cancel performances and staff fear layoffs. Floca is the builder, the man who talks boilers, chillers, seats, and structural systems. The center is literally shifting from being a national arts institution into something approaching a construction site, politically, physically, symbolically. That symbolism matters because Trump has always understood the power of architecture as theater. Buildings, walls, facades, ballrooms, brand names. To him, they are not merely physical objects, but statements of control. The article even notes that he spent part of his remarks discussing the White House renovation plans and describing onyx and spectacular stones for a new ballroom where the East Wing used to be. That detail is easy to skim past. It should not be. It tells you how Trump sees governance, not just as policy, but as renovation. Tear out what you dislike. Replace what you can brand. Put your name on the result. Declare the old version ruined and the new one magnificent. There is also a subtler form of tension here, the Supreme Court itself. The justices are already carrying a docket packed with Trump-era power questions. They have tariffs to reckon with, birthright citizenship, the firing of independent agency leaders, immigration protections. Every one of those cases touches a different branch of the same question. How much can this president do, how fast, and with how little constraint? The court's decision to hear argument in the TPS cases may not only reflect concern for migrants, it may reflect a deeper institutional worry about how many foundational issues are being shoved through emergency procedures without enough explanation. That does not mean the court is turning against Trump. It means the court understands the stakes. Because if it lets the administration act instantly in case after case without clearly defining the reasoning, it risks becoming an engine of executive acceleration rather than a check on it. This time, the justices may have decided that the political and legal temperature was too high for another unexplained emergency order. And that leaves Trump in a complicated position. He can still win later. He can still get the result he wants by summer. But he cannot claim he swept the board this week. Instead, the story became messier, more contested, more revealing. This is where the drama now deepens. Because the question is no longer just whether Trump can push his agenda. He clearly can. The question is whether the cumulative costs of that agenda, legal, political, institutional, moral, are beginning to create a different narrative, one in which the administration still looks powerful on the surface, but increasingly unstable beneath it. And if that narrative takes hold, the implications go far beyond Haitians, Syrians, or the Kennedy Center. They reach all the way to the future of Trump's second term. By the end of the day, the headlines looked disconnected. Supreme Court delays decision on migrant protections. Appeals Court allows third country deportations. Kennedy Center to shut for 2 years. Richard Grenell replaced. Airport security staffing drops during shutdown. Susie Wiles reveals cancer diagnosis. But taken together, these stories tell one bigger, more dangerous, and more fascinating story. They show a presidency trying to move faster than the institutions around it, and a country trying to decide whether it will be transformed by that speed or pushed to its limits by it. That is why this moment matters. For Trump, immigration remains the core of the political project. It is the issue on which he believes he is strongest, the issue where his base is most energized, and the issue where he sees legal complexity not as a reason for caution, but as an obstacle to bulldoze through. Ending TPS for Haitians and Syrians fits perfectly into that worldview. He is not merely enforcing the law as he sees it. He is redefining what protections are supposed to mean. Temporary, in this administration's telling, must actually mean temporary. Humanitarian discretion must bend back toward sovereign power. Legal uncertainty must favor the executive. And if that produces fear, disruption, or moral outrage, the White House sees that as proof it is finally doing what previous administrations refused to do. But America is not just a presidency. It is courts, statutes, labor systems, budgets, public institutions, and millions of people whose lives do not fit neatly into slogans. That is why the Supreme Court's pause landed so hard. It forced a second look. It said, in effect, that before hundreds of thousands of people lose the right to remain and work here legally, the country deserves a fuller argument. Before the government rewrites the fate of Haitians and Syrians with a stroke of administrative authority, the justices want to hear it tested in the open. Yet Trump also understands something his opponents sometimes forget. Conflict is politically useful to him. He may not mind that the court has set up a dramatic showdown for April. He may welcome the chance to campaign against judges, against the bureaucracy, against what he will call endless protections for people who should not be here. In his political universe, every institutional barrier can be turned into evidence that only he is serious enough to fix the system. The danger for his critics is assuming delay equals defeat. It does not. It simply changes the battlefield. What happens if Trump wins in summer? The consequences could be immediate and profound. Hundreds of thousands could lose lawful status. Employers would face disruption. Communities would face fear and dislocation. Deportation systems already under pressure would be asked to absorb the shock. And the administration would treat the ruling as validation not just of one policy, but of its entire theory of executive strength on immigration. What happens if he loses? That would not end the fight either. Trump would almost certainly use the decision as proof that the courts are obstructing the will of the elected president. He would attack the judges. He would push for other routes. He would fold the case into a broader argument that only more political power can break the resistance. In other words, either outcome fuels the larger narrative. The same is true of the Kennedy Center. If the renovation proceeds and the institution reopens under Trump's branding and programming vision, he will claim he rescued a decaying temple of elite culture and made it serve ordinary Americans again. If lawsuits, backlash, and financial strain deepen, critics will say he vandalized a national institution to satisfy ideological and personal cravings. Either way, it becomes a symbolic battlefield in the war over what American culture is supposed to represent. And the same pattern hangs over Homeland Security. If the shutdown pressure breaks and funding returns without major concessions, Trump will say he proved Democrats were willing to risk security for politics. If staffing shortages worsen and public frustration rises, the administration will have to explain how the government at the heart of its mass deportation campaign became a casualty of the very confrontation it escalated. This is the real future possibility buried inside all these stories. Not one giant collapse, but a grinding escalation in which every institution becomes a site of pressure. The courts, immigration courts, airports, cultural centers, federal departments, Congress, even the White House itself. Trump's second term is increasingly looking like an effort to run every major question in American life through the same engine of confrontation: immigration, arts, executive power, national identity, public spending, institutional loyalty, all of it. That is why the Supreme Court's deferral on TPS matters so much more than it first appears, because it interrupted the rhythm. It introduced uncertainty into a presidency built on projection of certainty. It reminded everyone that even now, even in a second term with sharper instincts and fewer inhibitions, Trump cannot simply will every outcome into existence on command. But he can still force the confrontation.